Late October 1977, the World's End pub on Edinburgh's Royal Mile. It's a busy Saturday night. Sometime around 11 o'clock, two teenage girls leave the pub. They are never seen alive again.
This was not the sort of thing that happened in Scotland or happened in Edinburgh.
Both were young girls just setting out on their journey.
Within 24 hours, the bodies of the two girls are discovered. They've been raped and strangled.
It changed how you lived your lives. You thought the poor girls, the poor girls, they were just out for a night, like myself and my friends.
They were basically raped, beaten, bludgeoned, stamped upon, beaten, bound, gagged, choked.
What becomes one of Britain's longest manhunts takes 30 years to come to a conclusion.
The investigation was huge.
It was one of the biggest cases that anyone of my generation had ever covered or been involved in.
And when the killer is finally brought to justice, it's forensic science that makes the difference.
There will always be a trace left behind. I think the issue for the police and for forensic scientists is to be able to retrieve those traces.
The historical city of Edinburgh in Scotland was a peaceful and friendly community in the late 1970s, with a thriving tourist industry and buzzing nightlife.
In 1977, Edinburgh was a quiet, some would say rather dowdy town.
A lot of people know a lot of other people. It's a very close-knit area.
Not a lot of trouble, not a lot of major violence. Welcoming for visitors, tourists, but also people just going out and socialising.
When I was a student, first having left home to go to study at university, going from the countryside to the big city in Edinburgh, I went out with my friends, and as a normal girl does, as Helen and Christine had done that night.
Saturday, October the 15th, two teenage girls set out with two of their friends for a night out in the pubs around Edinburgh.
The way that you mixed and socialised in these days was you went out to the pub. And when you were 17, it was a rite of passage that you got dressed up in your finery and you went to see whether you could persuade some barman to think you were 18 and have half a pint of beer or a glass of wine.
Helen and Christine had arranged to go out with two of their friends and what would have been a traditional pub crawl. They met at the top of the Royal Mile, nearer the castle, at one of the pubs there.
The girls, Christine Eady and Helen Scott, were best friends from primary school.
They both came from close and supportive families who knew each other, the families knew each other.
They seem to have been, just ordinary, average 17-year-old girls. Christine, she was a vibrant young girl, very amiable. She would go out with friends, very friendly. Helen had two half-sisters and a younger brother. She was the daughter of Maureen and Margaret. She was very family-orientated, good with kids. So she was really a really close family, close to her siblings. She left school at 16 and went to work in a kilt shop in the centre of Edinburgh.
They'd been friends from primary school, they were inseparable buddies, and they did everything together.
It was actually Helen's first night out in town.
Helen was wearing a very smart new Burberry coat, very upmarket, very expensive, that she'd bought with some of her first working wages. hugely proud of this coat. She was wearing her coat, looking very smart, Christine the same, dressed very smartly for the night out.
They had a small group of friends that they went out with. It was a bit of a celebration for getting their first jobs, and there were other girls, other contemporaries of theirs who were involved in the night out that night. So they were just dead ordinary, nice girls.
The World's End pub was the last venue for Christine and Helen on their tour of Edinburgh nightlife that night.
It's not a trendy nightclub or a trendy night spot. It's people where ordinary everyday folk go either after a day's work, they go there for a couple of beers, or maybe on a Friday night or a Saturday night go. Occasionally there might be some live music, but it's not big, it's not giant, it's not the sort of place you can lose folk in. You're always going to be within 2 or 3 feet, 10 feet at the most from your pals. If they're at a table, you're at the bar. If they're at the toilet, you're coming back out. You're always going to be wary and conscious of whereabouts your friends and your pals are.
Apparently, because at that time it had quite a late licence, so they could get a drink there up to midnight or whatever a late licence was in those days.
It had a really good folk and music scene, so it attracted a vast array of people, young and old, and people interested in music.
The noise of people talking and the atmosphere of the people is what keeps a place like that going. It's not about the music, it's not about any of that stuff, it's just folks sitting down having a giggle and a laugh with their mates.
When the girls arrived that Saturday, the pub was already packed. They ordered drinks at the bar and then sat down at a table.
The pub was pretty busy, there was about 150 people in there. The girls were approached by 2 men. One was about 5'3", 5'4", the other about 5'7", aged between about 21 and 30 years of age. These men began speaking to both Christine and Helen. Their friends Jackie and Tony were speaking with other people. They got invited to a party at Portobello, which is a couple of miles away. They thought, we'll invite our friends Helen and Christine along. So they approached them as they were talking to the men and asked them if they'd want to come to the party. I think Helen may have wanted to go, but Christine seemed to be quite interested in speaking to the 2 men and decided no, she didn't want to go. And Helen, obviously, because it's her closest friend, stayed with her. At that point, both Jackie and Tony left the pub, leaving Helen and Christine with the 2 men.
Sometime around 11 o'clock, the 2 men were seen leaving the pub. Christine and Helen were seen walking a little distance behind them. From here, the girls vanished.
A police officer who was on patrol in the street at the time spoke to the girls, because I think one of them had stumbled over and he had gone over to make sure that they were okay, and he gave evidence saying that they walked off down the road, apparently following 2 men, and it seems that they then got into a van, presumably having been offered the lift home.
In these days, people trusted folk. You didn't automatically think, why is this man trying to give me a lift?
And that was the last time they were seen alive.
At first, no one was too concerned that the girls hadn't come home.
They were expected home that night, but quite commonly what they would do is they would stay at each other's houses. So Helen would stay with Christine, or Christine would stay with Helen. So neither set of parents were concerned when they didn't come home.
Jackie Ingalls, their friend who had went to the party that morning, hadn't heard from Helen at 10 a.m. So she contacted Helen's father, Moraine. Now, they were obviously worried about Helen because this was her first night out, she hadn't come home. They'd assumed that maybe she'd went to Christine's house.
After about an hour or so of wondering where else they could be staying, were they staying with someone else's pal or with another family, whatever, they decided to phone the police and report the 2 girls as missing.
2 missing teenagers, but there was worse to come. The events of the 15th of October and the investigation that followed were to scar the city of Edinburgh for almost 4 decades.
It was a death of innocence, really, because Edinburgh was an old-fashioned but very safe place, or so it was thought.
I think most of us of a certain age in Edinburgh will never ever walk past that pub or be on the bus and see the name and not think about Helen Scott and Christine Eady.
By Sunday afternoon, the families of the two girls were expecting the worst. They didn't have long to wait to have their fears confirmed.
Once you read the actual details now of what was done to them, and you can only imagine their terror.
The two girls would have realised pretty quickly that these guys weren't going to be taking them home. Christine's home, it would have been a 3-minute drive. So within 5 minutes, they would have known they weren't going to Christine's home. And presumably they would, from that moment on, have been absolutely terrified.
Two lovely young girls with all of their lives ahead of them.
Christine's naked body was discovered in Gosford Bay, East Lothian, by a person walking their dog. Police were on the scene shortly after the discovery.
She was naked, she had been bound, her hands, her feet, and there had been ligatures placed around her throat and mouth. She also appeared to be very badly beaten and injured as well.
This was clearly, you know, a young girl who had been sexually assaulted and strangled.
A couple of hours later, police received another call. Helen's body had been found in a field 6 miles away from Christine's.
A local farmer from a few miles away phones in to say that he has found the body of a young woman lying at a place called Coates Farm.
Mr. Mackenzie, who is a local resident, was out walking along a road when he looked into a field that had recently been cropped, and he saw a bundle in the field. When he walked towards it, about 20 yards further in, he realised it was actually the body of a girl.
And she's still wearing her coat. This Burberry coat that she bought, the only item of clothing that she's wearing.
She had been strangled, she had been bound. The ligatures used were her own tights. She had also been gagged with her own underwear, but apparently she had managed to spit that out because that was found lying beside her head.
At this point, the police had no idea who the two victims were.
And just then, literally just then, word comes that there's two girls. Remember, there's no identification on them, there's no handbags, there's no purses, there's no names and addresses, nothing. There's nothing to indicate who these girls are. But just then, the report comes through that two girls have been reported missing from Edinburgh. And from the descriptions, the physical descriptions of Helen and Christine, it's pretty apparent from then that these are the two bodies that have been found in East Lothian.
Forensic samples were taken at the scene, and an extensive manhunt began. Detective work in 1977 was at best rudimentary, but police were hopeful they would get a match at some stage.
No mobile phones, no closed-circuit television, no information to be got from bank telling machines, none of the things which are standard now in major criminal investigations were there.
Forensics were really in their infancy in terms of scientific terms.
DNA in 1977, when the murders were committed, was not something that was in the police arsenal.
What the forensic scientists had to try and work on was fibres and blood that was left at the scene, blood typing, looking for any debris, any signs that culprits may have left at that time, so gathering up any materials there that was suspicious. So when they did do their forensics, they would make sure that everything was captured that they could at that time.
The physical evidence collected was from intimate swabs, the tights, bra and belt that were used as ligatures, and Helen's jumper and coat. It was Helen's coat that yielded the most material.
Semen was found both on the swabs and on the coat. But at that time, we were unable, apart from blood typing, we were unable really to tell much more.
This coat, which seemed to be quite new, so it's in good condition, but it was heavily stained with semen on the inside, on the lining, and there were a number of areas of blood staining on the outside. However, the semen on the inside of the back was definitely significant staining. There was a lot of it. We were able to do quite a bit of testing on it, but were unable to come up with anything that indicated who we might be looking at.
Police undertook a massive investigation right across the East Lothian region. This included door-to-door inquiries, media appearances, and what they believed was an accurate artist impression of one of the men.
One of the main bits of evidence they released into the media was the photo fit that they had done for both men. The pub was quite busy that night. There was 150 people in it, so they had quite a few individuals who were able to come forward and say, we had seen the girls, we'd seen these men, and they gave a photo fit description.
We also tracked down known sex offenders, people with a history of that kind of offending in our local area. We broadcast news and information about the murders far and wide. But after a year, we simply ran out of new lines of investigation. But we still had the forensics, and we were still confident that one day these would give us valuable information. And so the World's End investigation was never closed down. Never. There was always someone, usually a small team of people, who were proactively looking at new leads, and there were new leads coming in all the time. If someone was arrested for a serious sexual crime in another part of the country, we would automatically look at them to find out where they were on the 15th and 16th of October 1977. So that kind of investigation continued for the next 10 years.
But developments in forensic science were moving fast, and police were confident they would eventually get their man.
Had not been for the original team, way back in the 70s, preserving evidence properly, way in advance of techniques, not having any clue that DNA was going to come up at some point in the future, hadn't even been heard of, they'd never have got what they got.
In 1988, and with DNA in its infancy, the investigation team decided to use it to help move the case forward. Lester Knibb took some of the samples to Cellmark in Cambridge. The scientists managed to isolate and partially identify a DNA profile from semen stains on the coat.
Lester Knibb sent through samples from the intimate swabs and also from Helen and Christine's clothing that had been in storage. And when it was passed through to scientists, they conducted DNA tests and they found the first suspect DNA profile. The first male profile on the girl's samples that was clearly the murderer. That DNA profile was then placed on the National DNA Database, which had been running for a couple of years, and at that point had 2 million offenders on it.
The idea was that you would take a crime sample and run it through the system, and if you found a match on the database, although you didn't have a reference sample from a suspect, you'd be able then to say, well, this is a possibility that this individual has left this DNA.
For the detectives involved with the case, hopes were high.
We thought we couldn't fail. I remember sitting in the office, thinking about it, talking to some of the senior detectives, saying, we've done it, we've done it. All we needed to do was match this profile against our database, against English databases, against the databases held and being built then by various other law enforcement agencies, the FBI, Australia. We would match it, and up would come the culprit, because we believed that a person who had committed a crime like the World's End murders must be known to the police. And he would be on that database, and we would detect it. We would find out who it was.
So they were placing the new suspect profile on there in the hope that they would get a result, a hit on the person that had committed the murders. But they got nothing back.
I realised at that stage that there would probably be more opportunities when new suspects became available, and it would be easier if they kept samples at Cellmark so that any new reference samples coming in could just be transported and they could retrieve the material under their own specialist conditions.
Despite not finding a match on the DNA database, investigators still had a profile for the murderer and decided to carry out a massive swab campaign.
We DNA tested over 1,000 people, including all the main suspects from 1977, and got nothing. When I'm saying got nothing, we eliminated them all. We knew that none of those 1,000 people, who some of them were very, strongly suspected, were the culprit or were that offender DNA profile.
Another disappointment, but investigators knew that forensics were advancing at an incredible rate, and they were not going to give up. Despite a huge manhunt, the case had gone cold for 11 years, until advances in DNA provided a profile from the semen samples. However, it did not yield a match on the criminal database. Whilst waiting for new advances in DNA, detectives decided to explore other areas of forensics. The investigators then approached Lorna Dawson, a soil scientist who was researching a new forensic method of analysis.
They came and asked if there was anything we could do to look at soil samples which had been recovered from a murder in 1977.
The soil analysis was really to do with the soil on Helen's feet.
The question the police were trying to answer was, could Helen have been present on the beach? They were trying to piece together the sequence of events. So was Helen taken out of the van and was she walked on the beach with Christine? Those sorts of questions. So forensic science, forensic soil science, helps put the facts together. I applied for a grant to do a large research project to increase the reliability of soil as a forensic tool. So it's very useful, evidentially, in linking an unknown sample with a particular location.
The farmer who found Helen in his field told the police later that he had never ever changed. There'd always been the same crops he'd grown there. These are coastal fields. The soil in coastal fields is unique because it's got the salt and it's got the various other nutrients in it. But if you've always grown the same crop, your botanics over the years and the breakdown in the soil, they're not going to change.
Police provided the original crime scene soil samples to Professor Dawson for analysis.
After all these years, the wonder of having still material there is testament to the procedure and the recovery that the police in Lothian and Borders had taken. And when we opened these samples, for the first time since 1977, the bags were still intact, the seals were still intact, and the material was still there in the sample bags that had been taken all those years ago.
After analysing the different materials on Helen's feet, Professor Dawson could confirm that Helen had not walked on the beach. Unsurprisingly, she found that the soil grains from the field matched the soil found on Helen's feet.
We looked at the material that was recovered from Helen Scott's feet, and we could look at the grain size, the grain shape, the characteristics of the grains, the coatings that were on the grains. And from that, we could show that there was that very, very close similarity in all those features of the soil that was on her feet with the soil in Huntington Coats where she was recovered from.
But Professor Dawson also discovered particles from a different environment.
The material did not come from Gosford Beach and it did not come from the field at Huntington Coats. What it did have was characteristics of gypsum and fragments of steel, which suggested that she'd been in contact with a material that was from a painter or a builder's environment.
Forensic science was now helping to build an accurate sequence of the events of the night of the 15th of October, 1977. A new method of DNA testing had just been developed, and the police decided to see if they could get a more accurate result.
DNA technology advanced literally week on week, month on month, as it still does.
When PCR came along, that's polymerase chain reaction, there was discovered or invented a way of amplifying or increasing the amount of DNA that was present of that particular type. You could effectively recreate more of the same DNA that you started with. From a very small amount, you could create enough to do the proper tests.
Police asked Cellmark to do a more detailed analysis. They received a better DNA profile which they uploaded to the database.
By the end of 2002, we still did not have anything more than this single individual who had provided DNA, and that profile did not appear on the national database, so they had no idea who this individual was.
Familial DNA had become significant then, and that was a technique that you could use whereby instead of looking for the actual culprit themselves, you would look for parents or siblings of that culprit and try and track them through that way. So we set on another investigation trying to do that. A very technical exercise, but it didn't, again, take us anywhere. We didn't get the culprit. We decided to go a bit left field and go and look at the Y chromosome. Now, everybody's conventional DNA is different. The Y chromosome features an all-male DNA, and it never changes.
And we found some small parts of the staining were still available, including one small discrete stain on the item, possibly only a couple of millimeters in length. We cut that out and put it into a tube and sent it down to the Forensic Science Service, who performed the DNA on the paternal side, on the Y chromosome, and it was at that stage that they came up with a different profile.
He says it's very weak, but it's there.
At last, police had their suspicions confirmed. There were 2 men involved. They uploaded the second profile to the National DNA Database.
It comes back as a prisoner that's currently in Peterhead Prison in Aberdeen, and his name is Angus Robertson Sinclair.
In 1982, Angus Sinclair pleaded guilty to the rape of 11 girls in Glasgow.
They were young children, 8, 9 years old, who were in the vicinity.
Including a 9-year-old boy, which he always denied, but he said that he had done the rest. Nobody knows how many he actually committed. He didn't know how many he actually committed. He said that they could go into the hundreds.
Such is the seriousness of these crimes that he receives a life sentence for these attacks.
While in prison, Angus Sinclair was also found guilty for the murder of Mary Gallagher.
Mary Gallagher's killed in 1978, and Mary Gallagher is tiny. She's a diminutive size. She's a young woman, but she's tiny.
She had been walking home through some railway sidings. She'd been intercepted and taken into an area of scrubland, and she'd been sexually assaulted. A ligature had been tied around her throat using her own clothing. Again, the MO that Angus Sinclair would subsequently use in other murders.
What they were doing in the mid-90s was Operation Catch 'em, which was getting DNA samples from all known sex offenders who were then in prison. They got the one sample from this one man, which matched the sample on Mary Gallagher's clothes.
Police now began to delve deeper into Angus Sinclair's background.
Sinclair grew up in the St George's Cross area of Glasgow, working class area.
He was a bit of a lone wolf. began to change a bit when he was about 12, 13, involved in minor crime. And then as he got to 15, some of his crime became sexualised. He was involved in indecent exposure and crimes of that nature. And then we quickly grow from that time to Catherine Rehill.
At 15, Sinclair's murderous intentions had struck for the first time.
Angus managed to entice Catherine to go for a message for him and bring it back to his house. And thereupon, Angus attacked her and sexually assaulted her and murdered her.
Whilst he was in prison, he was examined psychologically by scientists. They were quite strong in their opinion that he wouldn't change and that he had no empathy and that he most likely would be a danger to anyone were he ever to be released. And he was released. He was released in 1967.
During that time, he learned a trade. He was a painter and decorator, and when he came out after the 7 years, he got some work as a painter and decorator. He also married, and he also had a child of his own. But at the same time, he was still giving in to his urges. He was attacking people, he was assaulting them, he was robbing them. He was also still interfering with children. He began his killing again, they believe, in 1977.
Police now knew about Sinclair, and they now focused their efforts on finding out the identity of the second man.
The minute we realised it was Sinclair's DNA, we then looked at his associates, his criminal associates, and clearly his family as well. So we had to see who he was linked to. Now, he was married to Sarah Hamilton. He had married Sarah in 1970. We were interested to see if Sinclair was linked to any of the male siblings. And very quickly, we began to learn that in 1977, Sinclair had formed a strong bond with Sarah's brother, Gordon Hamilton. It transpired that he had died in 1996, which was 8 years previously, and that he had no previous convictions. Ostensibly, he was someone who had become an alcoholic and then died through that disease.
Firmly beyond their reach, police were desperate to prove that he was the second man.
Alan Jones took up the investigation, remarkable piece of detective work, and discovered that he had often carried out little DIY jobs just for friends and neighbours.
What we didn't have were samples of his DNA. Because he had become ostracised with his family, nobody had kept any of his clothing, anything which would maybe harbour DNA that had been from Gordon Hamilton. He hadn't been to hospital, there wasn't any samples, histological samples we could get. So essentially, we had someone who had left no trace of themselves in terms of DNA in the world. So scientists at the time told us that one of the things we could do is try to look for something he's maybe touched or in the course of the time he was alive.
Somebody remembered that he had decorated this particular flat and that he had put coving on a ceiling where there hadn't been any before. And obviously someone who really knew their DNA had thought it's quite likely that he's licked that, or he quite often apparently lick the coving before they join two ends. And what a discovery it would be if this guy's DNA was there, and it was.
Police now had Hamilton's DNA. By examining the ligatures found on both Christine Eady and Helen Scott, the forensic team were now able to connect Sinclair and Hamilton to the murders. Through a new cold case investigation involving 3 Scottish police forces known as Operation Trinity, detectives began to look at a number of unsolved murders in Glasgow at around the same time as those of Christine and Helen.
The murder of Anna Kenny, Hilda Macaulay, Agnes Cooney, the more we looked at them, the more we realised they bore striking similarities to the murders of Helen and Christine. And so we began to jointly investigate that cluster of murders, which all took place within 6 months at the end of 1977 and the beginning of 1978.
To see if there was a connection, and that if indeed Angus Sinclair was that connection. Sinclair is particularly cruel, a psychopath. Some of the crimes that we have investigated that he committed in the past were brutal. You know, he would use hammers on people, he would bludgeon people with axes. He had no compassion or empathy, a typical psychopath. So the injuries that were inflicted upon these girls would be of the same nature.
Somehow, the original samples and all the evidence for those had gone missing. So the only murders that they could really focus on were Helen Scott and Christine Eady.
Police now moved to charge Angus Sinclair.
He was very polite, refused to answer any questions over the 2 or 3 hour period, but we still charged him because we had the evidence clearly. But in the aftermath of the charge, I sat down and spoke to him and talked about the families and how they didn't deserve any of this, and that what we're looking for was resolution, and that did he have any feelings about that? And he was quite nonplussed about it. He said, well, I understand what you're saying to me, but that's none of my business because I didn't commit these murders. He was very polite about it, and he did apologise for not answering our questions. He said, I'm really sorry about not answering your questions. I've just been advised not to do it. So very controlled, but no sense of any empathy or remorse. A very controlled character.
Angus Sinclair would stand trial for the murders of Christine Eady and Helen Scott.
We're all sitting thinking, great, finally we can get this guy done. We know he's been done previously. Let's think, right, so it's 30 years since these girls were killed. Let's see if we can get this guy. And it went horribly pear-shaped.
They decided to do it very, very simply and just go forward with the DNA.
Sinclair's DNA from swabs internally, Sinclair's DNA from semen on their clothes. So there was a fairly obvious defence which he offered, that he had had consensual sex with the girls, left the scene, and then his brother-in-law must have murdered them. Obviously preposterous.
He was acknowledging that his DNA very well was on the clothing and on the girls' intimate swabs, but it was consensual.
Despite the weight of forensics, the judge ruled that the evidence was insufficient to convict Sinclair.
They said it wasn't strong enough, but the police were very, very angry at that because they felt it would have been enough.
It seemed to raise some doubts about the power of DNA evidence, which really for years had been clearing up historic crimes.
We all know he did it, we're all hoping to see him getting done for it, and he's walked out of court again in a van back to do his life sentence. And there's no resolution, there's no closure for the families, which was the worst thing, I think, for the families.
This has been a miscarriage of justice. This can't stand.
There was huge pressure for a retrial, but something stood in the way. Double jeopardy, a law that prevents an accused person from being tried again on the same or similar charges, or on the same facts following a valid acquittal or conviction.
There was questions in Parliament about it, which was unheard of for a criminal case, and it gained such a momentum that they carried out a study to see how can we right this wrong.
The Scottish Government changed the law. They changed the double jeopardy rule.
With Sinclair now free to be retried, investigators now needed to find new evidence to present to the court. Using DNA technology, Alan Jones was able to structure a new case against Angus Sinclair.
We now had to look and see how we could get it retried. I was at a senior officers conference in England and happened to get to speak to some scientists there, and they were talking about new science in terms of being able to identify very degraded and faint elements of DNA. One was called spermolution, which detected these very, very faint degraded DNA, and the other was crime light, which was a highly intense light that was actually able to focus on actual cells. I took that technology back up to the Crown Office. We've got a potential to resubmit the old exhibits to this new test and see if we can get any more DNA. The Crown agreed to it and submitted the funding to allow these tests to go ahead. And they set about on this year-long forensic exercise to find new evidence in our case.
What Crownlight did was show and demonstrate that the Angus Sinclair's DNA had been left on the ligatures at the time the ligatures had been tied. It had been left there in a situation of stress. So it could not have been that it simply patted them or perhaps in some intimacy touched them. It had to be there when he was actually tying the knots. You had his DNA on the knots, you had his DNA on the bindings, and you had his DNA in the semen which is found on Helen's coat.
But importantly, both Sinclair's DNA and his brother-in-law's DNA is in both sets of knots, and both girls' DNA is in both sets of knots, which proves that both men were involved in killing both girls and were both there at the time when they died, and both carried out the crime together.
We've gone from 1 in a million to the new technology which was showing that Sinclair's DNA was 1 in a billion probability and certainty that it was him that was involved.
When the police trial began in 2014, police believed their evidence was rock solid.
The expert evidence presented by the scientists was astounding, and it was very well received by the court at the time.
One of the key experts was Professor Lorna Dawson, and she was able to give evidence about the soil samples and scrapings that were taken from Helen's feet. And her evidence was important, probably more on an emotive level in some ways.
We could say specifically that that soil had come from the particular field where she was found. We could also say that there was soil on her feet which had come from the very grass verge. So the grass verge that led from that field to the road where a vehicle would have been parked. So not only did she stand in the field where she was found, but she must have also stood on the grass area at the very edge of that field that night.
Now, if you're dragged into a field, you don't get soil and soles of your feet. You're carried into a field, you don't get soil and soles of your feet. The only way you get soil and soles of your feet is if you're being made to walk barefoot through a field to your death, probably having already seen your best pal killed or certainly heard it.
The jury found Angus Sinclair guilty on all charges.
I was sitting in my office and I was phoned up and told the outcome of the trial and the fact that true justice had been done.
He got minimum 37 years imprisonment, 37 years after these girls were killed. And it was poetic justice.
And their families finally got the justice they had been waiting for.
The fact that it had been 37 years of torture for the family, where they had to live through the moment of finding out about the girls' deaths to that moment in the court. And it seemed very apt that he said that, and it resonated with everybody that, you know, here was justice being seen to be done.
He appealed, believe it or not, saying that that was too harsh, but the appeal failed.
The efforts of Maureen Scott and the efforts of the police to keep it alive for so long meant that nobody forgot it. But I think it was just remarkable because it was a double. It was 2 young lives being snuffed out when they should have had everything to look forward to and to live for. He is undoubtedly, I think, one of the worst serial killers in history. I think that he spent years of his life going about his business, whatever he was doing, he was looking for another victim. I think it was always on his mind. The stuff that he carried about, he was always ready to attack. So whether he was going fishing or whether he was going to see friends, he was always ready. And if he saw a vulnerable woman on her own or a child during those years, he would move in and he would change their lives forever, or he would take their lives.